He's a Senior Vice President, Global Customer Service with Risk Management Solutions. He is here to speak with us today on a slightly different subject matter on accountability for the customer experience. So I don't think we gave a whole lot of insight or personal information, but one thing interesting about Brad is that by the age of 13, he had already traveled to 20 different countries. That's pretty interesting. So welcome, Brad. I look forward to a learning and thought-provoking session.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, everyone. Great to speak to you again. After you heard me mention yesterday that we have several volcanologists on our staff, and after a couple of questions, I felt the need to come back and clarify what that really means. A volcanologist is someone who studies volcanoes, not someone who studies the Vulcan race that you're familiar with on Star Trek. So what I'm going to talk to you about today, as Laura mentioned, is accountability for the customer experience and some of the best practices and lessons that I've learned over my career over the last 17 years of how to drive that within your organization. It's not going to be a really polished case study with fancy videos and programs that are already in place, mostly because with RMS, we're still building that. So I've been with the organization now for about 1.5 years. So a lot of what I'm going to share with you are things, in some cases, that we've done there or that we're doing there. In some cases, things that I've done or experienced from a prior life. And I'm also going to call out a few nuggets that I heard already this morning because I think they tie directly to some of these points, and they were illustrated, even though they weren't necessarily brought up that way, by Dan and George. So first thing we're going to talk about is who is RMS and what do they do? I said a little bit about it yesterday, but I'm going to give you a little bit more insight. We're going to talk about measurement and reward, the environment, and your senior executive commitment. Because I think when we look at accountability, there's really 3 dimensions to this. There's the individual and what they are personally accountable for. There is your department and division and the things that you're doing within the scope of that entity and how you drive accountability. And then there is the entire corporate level. And to get this firing on all cylinders, you've really got to have all 3. And so we're going to look at dimensions of each of those and go through some of those pieces. Does that sound reasonable? Okay. So first off, who are we? RMS. So RMS is not a large organization. We're not FedEx. We're not Wells Fargo. We're not Ritz-Carlton. We have about 950 people globally at the moment. And what we do is we service the insurance and reinsurance community, so business to business, and we provide the mathematical models that allow those customers to understand, based on all of the properties that they are taking out insurance for, that they are writing insurance against, what risks are they assuming in terms of the amount of dollar value loss as it relates to natural disasters. So we're talking hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes, tsunamis, severe winter storms, terrorism, okay, which is also one of those. So we do an awful lot of really complicated math, and we provide these algorithmic capabilities to the clients, and they take all of the places and locations and buildings that they are underwriting. They say, okay, what am I likely to lose this year, next year, if a Cat 5 strikes Miami, if we have multiple severe convective storms in the Midwest? So they dump all their properties and all of the detail about those properties. What type of construction is it? What type of soil is it built on? And we have variables for all of those elements in our models. Massive amounts of calculation go on. And they get back some numbers that say, okay, based on this portfolio of properties that you've got, if you're in Florida, hurricane risk is your primary risk. Here's what you should expect given the likelihood and severity of storms that hit Miami based on the stochastic probabilities and the numbers. And here's what sort of dollar value loss you should anticipate taking on your portfolio. And they use that information to then decide, am I assuming too much risk as an insurer? Do I have room to write more policy on more properties? If I have too much, maybe I give some of that off to a reinsurer or a broker. So it's a way of really diversifying yourself. So they may take a slice of that risk and sell it to another insurance company or a reinsurance company so that they take some of that off their books. Does that make sense? So we have an awful lot of scientists, seismologists, hydrologists, volcanologists. who work for us. We only have 200 customers, and we do $300 million in revenue. So it's very specialized, it's very B2B. It is never the sort of thing we will ever hear about on social media. No one tweets about their catastrophe models. But I think it's really important to recognize for us the focus of the number of customers versus the amount of revenue. So you're talking an average of more than $1 million per account and a very small number of accounts. So losing accounts to us is massive. Thankfully, the competition is not extremely fierce in this space. It's a very high barrier to entry to build these models and have this information and make it available. But what we're about to do as an organization, and we're in the process of it right now, is we are transitioning from being a company that primarily built those models with some really limited functionality software that allows the client to run them in their own premise, to becoming a cloud-based risk management platform. So I said a little bit about this yesterday. What that means to the customers is a single store of all their information that used to be all over the place in different systems, including some of it ours. The ability to process those thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of transactions in a couple of minutes through the cloud instead of what used to be a day or a couple of days in their own environment with the current software. Much richer functionality that allows them to visualize that risk and representation on maps, overlay storm surge and see how everything comes together and what the pictures of those risks look like, different analytical tools and dashboards. So a much richer front end, much faster speed, and also the platform is being designed so that it can handle not just our type of risk, but any type of risk. So you could extend this to other areas beyond property catastrophe, which is what we do, that gives the client a single stop shop for all of their risk management analysis and dashboarding. And we're also building an open source ecosystem where we're allowing third-party modelers, not just us. So you now no longer have to just use our models. We're allowing other modeling companies to put their models on the platform. We're allowing third parties to build applications that connect to the platform and do different things for the industry that our software doesn't do. Also third-party data providers that may have other information, like map overlays. Very significant transformation in us as a business, right? So as I've said in that last line, we're going from academics to execution, and we're going from math to software. Big changes for us as a company. And part of my job has been preparing the customer service organization with the right models and structures and programs that are going to allow us to become a global software as a service provider and meet the expectations of customers as we make that transition. So that's a little bit about RMS. So let's talk a little bit about accountability and tying it to the performance success. So you heard me mention that there were 3 dimensions to this: the individual, the department, and the company. This is the individual level. This is really, to me, the nuts and bolts of getting accountability in the right place. People do, ultimately, what they're rewarded to do. So if you have bonus programs, if you have incentivization tied to objective achievements, the more directly you can make the connection between their performing against a measurement that's tied to your customer experience improvement and their financial success in doing so, you're going to bring that individual level of accountability into line. Does that make sense? I'm sure some of you, I heard obviously from George and Dan, you heard them talk about metrics, measurement, dashboard. All of that stuff ultimately ties into holding an individual accountable for their performance to a dimension that's important to your improvement in the customer experience. The secret is picking which one, because you can't make them bonusable on 2,500, right? So you have to choose them very carefully, and what you choose is sometimes going to depend on what state of development your program is in and how far along you are. So I'll give you an RMS example here. So as I mentioned, when I got there a year and a half ago, we really didn't have a whole lot of KPIs or key performance indicators being measured or tied to individual performance. What do you think our average query resolution time was when I got there? Anybody take a guess? In hours. 3, don't I wish?
72. 24. 48.
220. 220. Wasn't being measured, wasn't really being managed. Again, remember, we were models, they were academics. So thankfully, a lot of our customers are also people who understand that sort of math, and it took them 5 days to run an analysis. So if it took us a day or two to get back to you, that's okay. It's not that bad. So first thing we did was we started to measure that resolution time, because as you guys know, in the customer service game, speed is the table stakes. You got to get quick at it first, and then the wows become expected behavior later. But we didn't even have the initial wow. So we started measuring on time. We tied that to people's objectives this year. Last month, our numbers that just came out yesterday were at 27 hours. So we've taken that down by nearly 90% in 12 months. Again, a lot of process being built, a lot of structure being put in place, but the most important message is what's measured is managed. As soon as myself and my leaders put a number on the page that said, guys, your bonus is tied to our ability to achieve that target, all of a sudden, the performance of that target became important to everybody. The dashboard started to appear, the reports started to appear, because if people are being held to it, they want to know, how are we doing? Why are we performing there? What's underneath that number? What can I push on to get better? We won't be able to keep that one there for long, because as we said, yesterday's wow is today's expected behavior. So our customers are incredibly satisfied with that improvement in performance, as you can appreciate. But that's going to transition, and we're going to need to change the bonusable measure in order to match that. So again, understand where you are in your life cycle. Don't feel you need to start with the ultimate goal when you're really just learning to walk. Learn to walk first and then build yourself up. The other key pieces of advice that I would offer here, whatever you choose has to be within the control or at least the significant capability of influence of the team member. Right? So you can't ask them to be accountable for a target on a measure that they can't affect. I think back to that, some of you in the audience may be old enough to remember this as I am, but I think back to the late 70s where there was this poster of Smokey the Bear, and it said, only you can prevent forest fires. And I thought, Jesus, that's a really big burden for a 9-year-old. If you make them accountable for something they can't control, they're not accountable. It's just words. It's hollow. So start with the thing they can control or at least significantly influence. It's also got to have an irrefutable connection to the experience you're trying to drive. And this may be natural or a very simplistic statement for those of you in some of the industries we heard about yesterday, hospitality, B2C, where it's very direct and it's very immediate. For some of us in the B2B world, that's harder because the way you measure what you're doing may not necessarily be a customer outside-in type of number. Right? So how long did it take us to get these products to market? How long did it take that department to do this thing? That's not the customer experience. What is the customer from the outside in seeing and feeling? And are you sure that the thing you're telling people they're going to be bonused on truly ties back to bring you the result that you're looking for? Otherwise, you could have great improvement in the performance numbers and no real impact to the customer. Does that make sense? And the last thing is they've got to be game-proof. So how many of you are familiar with the prisoner's dilemma? Game theory economics. This is as simple as people will behave in the most self-interested fashion possible, most of the time. If you understand that, you know what they're going to try to do. So what I would encourage you here is when you look at the metrics and the measures that you create, the one you want to use, think about how you could mess around with that to make it look like you're doing better than you are and expect your people are going to do that. And I'm serious, and construct it, so attack it with a black hat mentality and say, okay, if I was measuring that, how could I mess with that number? I could just not change this time setting when this thing happens, or I could accidentally forget to pass it over to this next person that I'm supposed to pass it over to. They will do it. They will think of every possible way to game this thing. So you have to think that through ahead of time and make it as game-proof as possible, because as soon as the money is on the line for those people, you'll get some gaming. It's natural. It will happen everywhere. And keep it simple. So back to the point that I mentioned earlier, you may have thousands of metrics. Pick one to make them accountable for it first. It doesn't mean that the others aren't important or that you don't measure them or that you don't use them. The way we think about these is operational measures are like a pyramid. So the top of the pyramid, there should be only at most 4 or 5 measurements that are driving your entire accountability and performance management. Underneath those, what feeds those numbers, there may be another 20 or 30. And below that, down at the individual nitty-gritty of your inquiry resolution, there's all sorts of things you want to be watching. You just got to pick the right one and the smallest number and keep them simple, because it keeps everybody focused. Make sense? Okay. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about NPS and why I don't like it. So I'm sure there's a line of people. I think it has its purpose, but I think what you heard George mention, NPS is a broadly based survey that asks a customer about several dimensions of your organization, culminating in a would you recommend or refer net promoter score question, which in and of itself is fine if your view is from the C-suite, and what you want to get a feel for is how does the customer feel about my brand and my overall business? Very helpful. If you try to make NPS the measure that you use to drive accountability, it will fail. And I'll tell you why. Because the questions that they ask are broad. They go across every area of your business. What do you think about our sales department? What do you think about the products we offer? How do you feel about the service? And as George mentioned, when the customer is considering all of those dimensions, and then it culminates in would you recommend us? What you can't do is it's very difficult to drive that rating back through to something that you can action, something specific. What do I need to do differently in order to move that score forward? We tried to use this at Thomson Reuters as a measure for our overall bonusable customer success. And the whole customer service department, we were stumped, right? Because they weren't asking the type of detailed questions that gave us actionable insight that allowed us to understand what we needed to do differently in order to move the needle. So what you had was a tragedy of the commons. Everybody in the company was responsible, and nobody could do anything about it because you didn't have explicit enough detail. So what we switched to is something called an event-based program. So unlike some of our friends in the hotel industry and some of the B2C spaces, as I mentioned yesterday, the number of touches and interactions that we have from a B2B perspective are limited. And they tend to occur around very specific types of things. The customer has a query, a problem that they call your contact center about. You are delivering training for the client on their site. You are dispatching a field service tech to go and make an install or an upgrade or do some repair or do something with the customer. So the way we designed our survey programs were around those events. And it made a world of difference in driving the accountability for our staff. So it's not to say you shouldn't use NPS and keep it as a high global barometer, but it was much more effective for our customer service agents to say, okay, here's what we're doing. Within 72 hours of you closing a ticket, we're going to survey that customer, and we're going to ask them not about what they think of the company. We're going to ask them what they think about that thing that you just did. How knowledgeable was the agent? How quick, what was your perception of the speed of the resolution? What was your perception of the quality of the service that you got? What was your perception of the ease of access that you had to us as a service organization? And then culminated in an overall satisfaction question for the experience, that individual interaction. Does that make sense? Now what I get back is I know that interaction was run by Chachi, right? Because his name's on the inquiry. And we know exactly what the customer thought about what Chachi did. I'm irrefutably tied to the experience that the client has had. So Chachi can say, well, that's not right. I didn't do it that way. That's not what I meant. It doesn't matter. The customer's perception is clear, and the number they've given you is right there. So as long as I'm ensuring that I get a statistically valid number of surveys about Chachi's interactions as a whole, I can turn that into a bonusable KPI for Chachi, month on month, quarter on quarter, right? So that would look something like you've got to have at least 80% very good or excellent rating on the client satisfaction scores attributable to the queries that we surveyed for you. It's perfect. It's personal, it's specific, it's actionable, and it's irrefutable. If they said the problem is he's not fast enough, or knowledge level wasn't right, or It's too hard to get through. Some of the things, yes, they would identify systemic changes or process improvements you need to make within your organization, and you can't lose sight of that. But we have individual accountability to the specifics of what they're performing. Made a big difference. Make sense? Okay, cool. So that was about the individual. I want to talk a little bit now about the environment that you create within your department and your division. So, obviously the actions that we take, we've heard a lot about culture, and culture is a key dimension in this. The actions we take speak much louder than the words in reinforcing our desire to say to staff, we want you to be accountable for this. Only you can prevent the forest fires, right? So how do we create an environment that walks the walk of that talk? And I think there's 3 key dimensions that I've found to be really effective at that. The first is empowering them as much as possible. We'll talk a bit about that. Creating the structure and tools for their growth. And then how to embed it within the culture of your department or division. So from an empowerment perspective, the meta message we want to send is, we trust you to prevent the forest fire, right? We believe you can make the right decisions that will create the experience that we're after. So how do we back that up? One of the things that I've found is process is your friend a lot of the time. It can also be your enemy. If your processes are too constrictive, that they don't allow the individual the flexibility to make decisions based on the situation, and they have to follow the steps regardless of what's going on, you're not really reinforcing that accountability. What you're saying is, I don't think you can free think your way to the right answer. I'm going to tell you what to do, and I don't care what the situation is. You follow steps 1 through 8. That's not driving accountability at all. And this may look like different things in your business. So it might be, you heard, I think it was George mention, that his reps have the ability to bypass the process and escalate immediately. That's an example of that decision making. Maybe it's, if you're in a retail environment, maybe it's the ability for that rep to have decision-making control over refunds or exchanges or other free things to give the customer in a setting, right? Give them a window or a latitude that allows them to make the choices based on the situation. If, on the other hand, your organization says, no, you know what? To get a refund, you've got to go through 2 supervisors because we don't want to give any money back. That's not sending the message that says we're accountable to helping you be accountable at all. Right? Be accountable, but you know, no control. Only you can prevent forest fires, but I've got the hose, and you've got to come to me if you want the hose. Escalation, we mentioned. George gave us a great example of that. And I think this last one is one of the most important ones. So new program, process, or policy design. And we heard this in several of the speakers yesterday, and I think we heard it also from Dan and maybe George as well this morning. Your folks in customer service are going to know what needs to be done differently to make the experience better. Let them own the design and improvement of those programs and those processes. When you let them own them, you've got much more buy-in. You're going to get a greater base of ideas and more effective implementation because of the buy-in than if you have management trying to push it down. Let them be a part of that. Create those teams that say, right, what do we need to do differently? What's getting in our way here? Let them come up with that. That sends the message of, we trust you to make the right decisions on behalf of our customers. Good? Okay. Structure and tools for growth. So here the message we want to make sure we're sending is, we as an organization or a division, actually, or department, customer service, we're prepared to give you the tools that you need to be more accountable. Right? So it's very easy, and I had a couple of experiences in my past where the senior executives would say to me, you own the customer experience, you've got to make it better. And I said, okay, well, here's what I need. And they've said, no, we're not spending any money on that. Yeah. So then what would you like me to do? Dance my way out of this situation? You've got to walk the walk in supporting those things. And here are some examples of what that might look like. So one of the things we've done at RMS is we built a skills framework and a learning program that highlighted all of the competencies, hard and soft skills, that we expected people to develop gave them visibility on the career path of roles within our organization, laid out how the extension and development of those skills tied into those different levels of role, and then built the learning programs and materials that helped them get the skills that they needed to take that next step. That's showing the commitment to making them better and putting programs in place. We also built a self-service portal. RMS didn't have one at all. And one of the key things that we were seeing is online documentation access was a big source of inquiry from our customers. The material was out there. It was hard to search. It was only a series of links. You had a difficult time finding the piece of the document you wanted to see. We heard this from our staff. We heard it from our customers. We said, okay, we need to make an investment here. We need to put in place some tools that will allow you, as the agents, to access the information more easily and allow the customers to access the information more easily. Better experience, fewer inquiries, faster turnaround, but it cost money and time. Right? So investment of time and resources into the things that are currently preventing them from making the experience better. So we get back to those groups that we talked about where you ask them to tell you what it is that needs to be done in your business to make the experience better. This is some of what's going to come out of that. And some of those examples might look like, may look differently than a self-service portal or a learning program. They may look like, I believe it was George that mentioned access to systems and information. Why force a process to take an inquiry to another department if it's only to access information? Take out the steps. Is there a reason that you shouldn't have your frontline folks accessing certain systems, data, information? It may be because they're spread out in your business and they're all over the place, but that's fine. That's trainable. You can learn that. It may look like operational processes that compartmentalize the business. So similarly, you may have silos in your organization that say, okay, anything to do with money, it's got to go to accounting. Does it? All the time? How much money? Under $100? Look for the opportunities to break down those barriers and give them access and information and the tools to be able to be more accountable, because that's supporting that message. It may be technology, right? It may be your CRM system. It may be your telephony system. It may be the lack of a self-service portal. You got to be willing to spend the time and the money, hopefully with some of these people involved, because that's going to get you better buy-in and a better result, to remove the barriers that are holding them back internally from delivering the experience that you want them to deliver for the customer and you want them to be accountable for. That sends the message that says we as a division and as a department are as committed to being accountable as we're asking you to be as an individual. And that's what you want. Make sense? Okay. So now embedding it in your culture. This is the trickiest one because it's so easy to lose sight of. Right? Remember, culture is a social construction. People are reading their peers, they're looking in themselves for past behavior, and they're reading the signals of those above them in stature and rank to determine what behaviors are rewarded and punished in your organization. And our brains are much better at making connections between subtle things than you might appreciate. So if you said, responsiveness is absolutely critical for our customer and our organization, but you don't answer your own emails in 3 days? What signal are you really sending them? Do as I say, not as I do, right? So you've got to be thinking about it in those dimensions and ensure that the cultural behaviors you're driving for customer service are also the ones you're willing to embrace internally. And I think if you think about some of the consistent messaging that we heard from several people over the last couple of days, it was about making the internal and the external behavioral experiences and expectations identical. Because if you try to separate them and say, this is what we do for customers, but we don't bother with that ourselves. When your staff sees someone getting promoted, which one are they getting promoted for? Hard to tell. Right? So you've got to try to tie those up as much as possible. Celebrating successes, big and small, I think this is one you guys are familiar with. We've heard a lot of great programs in the last couple of days. The message I would give you here and what I would share is this does not have to be large in scale or a large dollar type of program. Some of these things are dead simple and take less than 60 seconds. So one of the things I've implemented is I've asked every one of my managers at their team meetings to spend 1 minute and actually call out something specific that someone on the team did that really reinforced the right behaviors for the customer. Chachi, I really loved the way you didn't pass the buck on that problem that I saw you working on for this customer. I thought it was great that you did this, this, and this. Well done. What was that, 20 seconds? But everybody else in the room now looks at that and goes, huh, look, the boss is calling out Chachi. I want to get called out by the boss. Maybe I should do some of those things. So subconsciously, you're creating an environment of people want to be appreciated and recognized. And when you take the time to do it in something as simple as that, the message you're sending to the rest of the group is it's important to us, I appreciate it, and I'm going to give you recognition in front of your peers when you do it. Those are three pretty powerful things, and that cost nothing and took no time. The great programs and big programs are fabulous, and they're great, especially across larger organizations. The message I want to deliver to you is don't feel that if you don't have that you can't do this. There's lots of small ways to be reinforcing that behavior and embedding it in the culture and making it important because it's important to you as the leader. Again, coming back to where we take our signals from. Those above us in status and rank and what they say, what they do, who gets rewarded, and who gets punished. It's key. Shared bonus targets with the group. So if you make your reps accountable with a KPI for the experience, but you don't have it yourself or your managers don't have it, that's not sending the message of shared accountability. You've got to have the same targets up and down the chain. And we'll see in a minute how going even beyond your own division is really important if you want it working on all cylinders. But within your group, you can't ask the agents to be accountable for something that you're not also putting yourself on the hook for as the leader. Be curious and involved. So again, this is about showing them and demonstrating what's important. Remember, coming back to what as a senior leader are you making important? If you're curious about the things you've asked them to do, hey, what did you think about that number this month? Why was our number better? Why do you think it was worse? And you're involved in that. Yeah, I'd like to be a part of that idea team that's working on this thing. I think I got a couple of thoughts. I'd love to be involved. If you detach yourself and you allow them to do it and see it and do as I say, not as I do, that perception of shared accountability is not going to be there. The more involved you are, the more curious you are, the more you want to be a part of that nitty-gritty, that's worth its weight in gold. And illustrating the desired behaviors consistently. This is the hardest bit with culture. Right? A lot of us may have mission statements and visions and values, and there are a bunch of pretty words on a page that marketing has glossed up. But the real culture is what you do day in and day out. Back to how you demonstrate what's important and what's rewarded. If you make speed of responsiveness a key thing and don't answer your email or never return voicemails, you're sending inconsistent signals. So you've got to be prepared to take it down to that basic level and live it every day as leaders in order to reinforce that culture. Make sense? All right. So the last area that I want to talk about is senior leadership support. So we've talked about the individual. We talked about the department. You'll hear a lot of organizations say, oh, yes, customer experience is very important. Customer service is key. And we've seen some great examples over the last couple of days where it is. Right? So I think it was Dan who mentioned that the senior executives at FedEx are held accountable for the performance numbers on the dashboard coming out of customer experience, customer service. Fabulous. You've got that buy-in all the way at the top. We also heard Laura mention that only 26% of organizations actually do that. So I experienced this in between Thomson Reuters and RMS. I was at another company that wasn't so good, which I'm not going to name. But in that case, I had the CEO who would say to me, hey, this customer's at risk. They're going to cancel. You need to go and fix that. Okay? So I'd go and talk to the customer, and the customer would say, well, your products don't have the functionality we need. Your performance in this area isn't good enough. Yada, yada, yada. All right, I bring that back, and they say, all right, so did you save them? Well, who else is involved in this? Is the experience my problem as the customer service department? If that's the case, your program's not going to get very far and your accountability is not going to get very far. Because every time one of your agents or your managers or yourself find one of those things, one of those ideas that says, hey, you know why everybody's pissed off? They're pissed off because that bit of the product doesn't work. Product team, I don't have time. Busy. Can't talk to you. Okay, so we're not really accountable as an organization then. So some of the things you want to look for, it's very key to understand how big a card game you want to play with your company on this. And what you need to understand in making those bets is how invested are your senior leadership in really getting this done? How far should you be able to push the envelope, and how likely are you to be successful in doing so? A couple of questions that I've found really helpful in determining the true state of readiness of your organization for being accountable are a couple that I've put up here. What's the highest level individual in your organization that has a bonusable target associated with customer experience or customer service? Is it the agent? Is it the manager? Is it you? Is it the C-level? Is it the CEO? How far up the chain that goes will tell you how willing your organization is to truly be accountable for the experience and the improvement of it. How much engagement goes on outside the client-facing teams? This one is really telltale. So back to that story I just told, whenever there was a problem with a customer, the client-facing team was expected to sort it all out. You never had product people talk to the client. You never had operational people talk to the client. The amount of engagement that you see within your company outside the client-facing division, if you're not in something like hoteling where everybody's touching the client all the time, will give you a really good idea of how committed your organization truly is to doing something about it. RMS, I can say, is extremely good at this. So we have senior leadership meetings and people from operations are saying, I was talking to the client at Munich Re yesterday and they said da, 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 da. Excellent. Everybody's in touch, everybody's engaged. It's important to them. And the last one is, where does improving the experience sit on the list of corporate priorities? So when you get objectives that come down, those corporate objectives, those of us in the B2B world are very familiar with this. At the beginning of the year, there'll be 3 very short statements with less than 10 words each that describe everything that the company is expected to do in the next year. Is customer experience in there? If it is, you're in really good shape. If it's not, you've got some work to do. Because obviously when you're looking for budgets and you're looking for time and you're looking for people to make the experience better and share that accountability and drive it forward, usually you're going to come up against that kind of a barrier where they're going to say, well, what do you need that money for? Well, we're going to make the experience better. Only we can prevent the forest fires. And they're going to say, well, some forest fires are okay. Right? You're going to struggle to get your money. You're going to struggle to get your people. You're going to struggle to get the attention. And that's going to make you frustrated, and it's going to make your people frustrated. And it's going to make them question whether or not that accountability is really there and really shared. That was basically everything I had to share. So I've told you everything I know about the subject in, what, about 30 minutes.
Nice job, Brad. We have time for a few questions from the group.
Nothing.
Wow. Okay.
Thank you, Marcy.
I'm here for you, Brad.
I appreciate that.
On one of your slides, you were talking about giving your employees the tools they needed. And
Yes.
I think there was something in there that talked about financials.
Yes.
And I'm afraid I didn't really catch what that was about. What level of education do you do for that?
So when I said financials, what that meant was the ability for them to make smaller, controlled monetary decisions on behalf of the customer. Right? Whatever that looks like in your business. It may be, hey, we'll refund you for that thing that turned up broken, or it might be something else. But it's about not to say that you should have them, randomly throwing thousands of dollars around until you're comfortable. We heard a couple other programs where once we get to know that you know what you're doing, we'll give you a little bit more latitude. But it's about allowing the decision to make it right, to live with the person that's having the interaction with the customer at the closest point. And not saying, well, hey, now we're talking about money, you've got to get the approval of the salesperson and the relationship owner and finance and accounting. It's a $50 item. What you gain in satisfaction is going to well outweigh the $50 you've just given them back. right? That's where I was going with financials.
You mentioned the idea of not giving your frontline an objective that you don't have.
Yes.
What about an objective that you have that they don't?
So I think this is where the interpretation part that I was saying a little bit about yesterday comes in, right? So in the worlds that I come from, what will come down from the CEO are 3 10-word statements that says, thou shalt, thou shalt, thou shalt. My guys don't know what to do with that from an objective perspective. So part of my job as a leader and part of the leaders within my team, a key part of their job is to say, okay, what does that mean to us? Let's translate the 10 words into something that's very much more specific to the job that we do in our department. And then that can get cascaded. And then at each of my leaders' levels or down to their managers' levels, they will take those and say, okay, this is what that means to you, Chachi, or you, Joni, specifically. Right? So they tie up and they tie down. They may not be exactly the same number. So I might have the overall group performance of a particular target. The leader might have their segment or their team's performance in that target, and the individual may have then their own. But sure, I'm going to have some, I'm not going to have budgetary ownership, for example, going all the way down to staff and hitting that number. So there's something that looks like, but it may not be the same.
Question up front.
I really just like the microphone. I'm interested in your learning program in terms of, I'm thinking about taking folks off the floor and putting them through training and what that looks like to call statistics. So can you expand on what your learning program includes?
So I think the key is blended learning, right? So what we've instituted is a lot more focus on the development of electronic learning modules that are no longer than 20 minutes in time. Okay? And what we're saying to the staff are, when you have a window, right? So we've deliberately made them less than the 30-minute segment of a meeting so that you could do one in any short stretch you happen to have when you weren't involved in a query or the resolution of a query. So whenever you get some downtime, go to the library, grab something, 20 minutes, boom, you can get a hit on negotiation skills or interpersonal skills or active listening or hard skills, volcanology, if that's what you need. So I think that's the key, because obviously to take large numbers of people out for chalk and talk sessions is tough. Don't overlook the value of the electronic learning libraries that are out there in a more standardized way, or potentially spending some time and money in creating ones that are customized to you for what you need to learn that isn't out there.
Great. Well, Brad, thanks for the
Thank you.
good information, real time.